think I shared that with
Lately, it seems every passing second brings news of another climate driven disaster. But we still have the power to turn back the clock. Harnessing the power of collective human energy, today's university students are working together to chart a new future, demanding and creating the solutions for a sustainable climate. Our focus in science, engineering, activism, and politics offers the potential of a better tomorrow for all of us. Tune in to Campus Climate Corps for news of what is and what is not happening at this year's UN Climate Conference. Prepare for a livable tomorrow with a life and career of action. Join us and become part of the solution.
all right. It is yet another conference of parties, second week of our conference of parties. And yes, we are once again live to you from COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan, with I believe our daily briefing number 8. For those of you who have tuned in for our last week's broadcast, you may have noticed that there was a lot of uh, tension happening over at COP29 with regard to the fact that Azerbaijan is hosting it, and that is spilling over now into week 2 in ways that we will go over during this broadcast. As always, we're very grateful that you're joining us from no matter where you're listening to. For those of you who don't know, my name is Rocco Vajati Jr. I'm a director of Campus Climate Corps, and the rest of the folks that will be on the broadcast tonight, Michael Fidler, another director, and Matthew Hill, who's also here from the University of Florida with Campus Climate Corps. So we're very grateful to have each and every one of you here with our broadcast today. So without further ado, let's go ahead and go over the major events taking place here at COP29. Okay, so today was Food, Agriculture, and Water Day. Many of the COP29 sessions throughout many of the pavilions were reflective of this. Essentially, for those of you who are aware of the role agriculture plays, and for those of you who may not know of that role, agriculture takes about 22 to about 25% of all global carbon emissions, which is a massive, massive carbon budget. So our goal, or at least the goal of COP29 here during today, was to talk about ways to reduce that overall carbon footprint whenever you eat everything from a Big Mac to just taking out an orange from an orange tree if you live in Florida or no matter where you are. The idea is we need to reduce our global carbon footprint when it comes to agriculture in multitude of different ways. But there's also the water implications as well. And today, as you will see from some of our presentations, water plays an extraordinarily important role here at COP29, especially given the fact that as rivers dry up, as glaciers begin to completely melt, this has major implications for many of the countries who are dependent upon water supplies from those sources. One of the big major things that came out of today was once again climate finance. COP29 is currently engaged in negotiations to establish at least a climate finance target ranging from 300 to 500 billion. Last week, that number was as high as $1 trillion of annual funding. However, now that is brought down to, well, between 300 and 500 billion, mostly due to the actual worries by the next bullet point here that the United Nations and the US are very cautious about committing to significant financial responsibilities ahead of the expected policy shifts with the incoming Trump administration. So from 1 billion to 300 to 500 billion, mostly because of the potential incoming Trump administration dealing with how they expect to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accords and the implications that that has for any significant policy changes made here at COP29. The shadow of Trump or the specter of Trump really does hang very large and looming over these negotiations. There are many discussions to, and at least attempts to engage financially, to engage financially capable countries to contribute to climate finance, mostly by developing nations who you may hear from our presentations a little bit later today in today's broadcast, but many developing nations are clamoring for financial reform despite the fact that Trump administration is threatening those climate talks. China and Saudi Arabia are showing resistance to participating in these expanding framework, mostly due to, or partially due to the US, but also partially due to the fact that Saudi Arabia has historically not commit or not really admitted as large of a carbon balance or budget as some of the other larger nations. But China specifically is showing resistance because they are expecting to reach their net zero goals by 2060. And there's still many discussions of reaching net zero by 2050 or expecting financial contributions from China to hit that 2050 goal in margin. There's also the issue that China still wants to be considered as a developing nation during these negotiations. Now, what that means is very interesting in particular to how we discuss Article 6 and specifically Article 6.3 in the Paris Climate Accords, which defines there are two different types of nations in the world. There are those who are developed nations and developing nations. And developed nations have a financial responsibility according to the Paris Climate Accords to assist those developing nations, whereas developing nations have a responsibility to accept financial offerings from the developed nations in order to help them adjust and become rapidly sustainable without polluting or without going through the industrialization phase that many of the developed nations have already gone through. These negotiations are extraordinarily critical for expanding the global participation in funding climate action. And this is despite the massive geopolitical tensions posed by the Trump administration, but also due to the fact that there are multiple wars taking place across the planet today that have implications on these climate negotiations. Now, a particular interest, a session that I was watching, at least online, because I was not allowed access to the rooms here, was the Gas Exporting Countries Forum and how OPEC was invited to discuss collaborative steps to combat climate change at COP29. I don't think we need to go into a massive discussion on why OPEC had such a large seat at the table here. However, needless to say, this is casting a lot of shadows of doubt upon COP29 as the fact that OPEC having a seat at the table, especially a major seat at the table, is fairly dangerous because of this next bullet point that I've surmised here, which is um, OPEC wants to emphasize the role of natural gas as a vital component in the transition to sustainable energy. So OPEC going on stage and saying this and suggesting that coal is the big enemy of our world and natural gas is still a vital component in this is an extraordinarily dangerous assertion. And the only reason they're able to make these assertions at this point is because this is being hosted in Azerbaijan, which is an oil-rich nation, a natural gas-rich nation. They are exploring technological innovations and sustainable practices. However, a lot of protests that took place today across the world after OPEC was given the ability to speak at this event does really showcase just how big of a hit that big BS button as fast as we can, as hard as we can, on the fact that OPEC is being given such a major role at these events and the fact that they're still championing natural gas as some major alternative to the coal industry and that how that is the end all be all. Now, these discussions highlight the need for a unified approach among the gas exporting countries to address global climate change challenges because this is their industry and because this is how they expect to survive within the 21st century. Not necessarily as an organization which is against coal and therefore natural gas is good, but a way just to make profit in the 21st century. And that pretty much wraps up my segment for today, going over some of the overview for COP29. I'm now going to pass it over to Matthew Hill, who's going to talk about some of the sessions that he's seen and explored today and some of the observations that he has made. So, Matthew, we'll give it over to you.
Right. Good evening, everyone. It is great to be here. COP29 has been quite the adventure so far, and we've seen some interesting stuff today throughout the week. And so we're going to go ahead and get into it. So the first event that I saw this morning was a high-level event targeted around methane emissions. And so this is a very thematic choice to start the day off with. Methane is another greenhouse gas, and it is one that actually is far more potent, excuse me, than carbon dioxide. But thankfully, there's less of it, so it balances out a little bit. And so this was an event around reducing methane specifically from organic waste. And it involved a bunch of statements from environmental ministers from around the world, including the COP29 president, who is the environmental minister here in Azerbaijan. Um, and together, this event focused around basically a voluntary commitment of all of these nations to reduce their own methane emissions. And in kind of in keeping with the trends of these, get together of national leaders to come together and say what they're going to do, there were no specific numbers cited or committed to. There weren't any really hard plans expressed, but they all seemed to agree that cutting methane emissions was a good idea. So I guess that's a step forward, if anything. And there was also very strong focus on the reduction of food waste, which, at least in their words, is the strongest source of methane emissions. So it was a very interesting event. It was quite a sight to see all of the environmental ministers come together in one room and agree on something. And we can only hope that these words are going to be followed by actions to actually reduce methane emissions, which could go a very long way in fighting global warming because methane is so strong. Um, any attempts to cut the emissions there will have quite an effect on reversing warming. So it is certainly a very valuable target, even if methane is a little bit less present in the atmosphere than carbon. Now, to touch a little bit on what Rock spoke about just now, COP29 has been largely finance focused throughout this week and last week. And a lot of these finance discussions have targeted something called the NCQG, which stands for the New Collective Quantified Goal, which is basically the goal of all of this finance talk to come up with a number and a plan to get that number of finance put together that we can use to solve global warming or work towards it. And there's been a lot of estimates thrown around from it, but a lot of economists have targeted about 1 trillion USD for the NCQG, which is a lot of money. $1 trillion is a lot of money to put together. So as you can imagine, lots and lots of debate has ensued from hearing this number as to how this fund is going to be constructed. And as the Republicans often say, who's going to pay for it? It's a very important question. So lots and lots of debate has come up here, and no one really has come forth and said, "Oh, me, I want to pay $1 trillion." And that's where a lot of negotiations have. That's what a lot of negotiations have been negotiating recently. And so some very interesting ideas have come up as to how we can get up to that 1 trillion US dollars. Um, a nice one is taxing billionaires. No one's ever suggested that before. It's a very novel idea. So it's good that things like, taxes for the rich are finally being talked about at these events. Taxing frequent flyers is an interesting one I read about. Also taxing fossil fuel extraction or even stopping fossil fuel subsidies. Subsidies are kind of like a reverse tax where the government just like gives out the money to a corporation, wow, from the money that they took from the people. So stopping subsidies of fossil fuels could go quite a long way in retaining money that we could use for a climate fund and also not actively funding the environmental degradation that we're worried about. And in terms of fossil fuel subsidies specifically, um, this idea of stopping those subsidies has quite a lot of momentum in a lot of the demonstrations and social movements that have been here at COP. And we're going to talk about those in just a couple minutes. Um, but one more thing specifically regarding the new collective quantified goal that I do want to talk about is the difference between loans and grants, as in does this money, if it's put into a fund to work against climate change, will it need to be paid back? And that's a very important question to ask. And a lot of the people that, a lot of the representatives, excuse me, that are very passionate about this are representatives from smaller island developing states or SIDS, they have been throughout COP29 calling for debt relief as they are struggling to put any money towards climate adaptation, all the while being people who, being nations who, on the whole, contribute the least to climate change, but get some of the worst effects from it. We discussed a little bit last week of how things like debt relief can actually go a long way in actually providing countries with the opportunity to work towards climate adaptation and mitigation. And so whether the NCQG becomes a loan or it takes the form of a grant is a very important question and definitely something to look out for as the negotiations continue. And that's assuming the money is put there in the first place. Um, and one last note about this, the climate finance that we've all been talking about here at COP has received some attention at the G20, which is another global summit going on right now, which is an interesting timing choice. But many, many world leaders are over at that G20. Some of them left the COP to go to there. Some world leaders like Biden went to the G20, but not the COP. Some interesting dynamics going on there, but it is important to note the G20, which is this collection of countries, about 80% of both the world economy and global greenhouse gas emissions, about 80% either way, both of those come from the G20. So these are some very important actors when it comes to solving the climate crisis, or worsening the climate crisis as it seems to be now. So it's quite interesting to see who from each conference is calling for what sort of change, especially when people like Biden and several others as well will attend the G20 and then proceed to call for climate action, but not be present at the conference that's about climate action. A lot of dynamics and politics going on there. So definitely another conference to keep up with if you're a huge politics nerd. Definitely keep up with the G20. Um, and one last subject that I will talk about, and we've discussed these a little bit. I'm sure there will be some pictures from Michael later on about these, but those are going to be the protests and demonstrations that have been going on today. And I personally saw quite a few today. It seems like in general, protests, as COP29 has gone on, demonstrations have been getting louder, larger, and more frequent. So it's definitely good to see that more people are getting able to kind of stand out and say their piece. But the levels of protest, of course, have still been nowhere near the sort of standard levels of demonstration that used to be common at COPs in the past. So it's interesting to see that they're growing and evolving here, but still nowhere near what we might expect, some years ago. And today specifically, I think I saw one of my favorite protests yet, and I'll tell you why. So, as Rock talked about, today was themed around food and water. And so there were quite a few vegan demonstrations going on. So, of course, that's a very thematic thing to have a food protest on the food day. Oh, I screwed up my notes. 1 second. Yes. So yeah, very thematic to have vegan related protests and demonstrations on a day centering around food. And at this venue specifically, it's quite interesting to see the food. There is food available at the conference, very, very overpriced and not quite good food. But most of them are not vegan options. There's only one, and it's just as expensive as the rest of them. So the default is not exactly the most climate friendly. Generally speaking, meat products will come along with higher carbon emissions, as well as pretty water intense processes to create them in the first place. So it definitely makes sense that, today of all days on the food day, there would be quite a few vegan demonstrators out. And the reason that some of these were my favorite is because I got something cool from it. Someone actually handed me a flyer with a guide on how to make your own tofu and your own soy milk, and I just thought that was super cool. I'm personally not at all a fan of soy, just in general. However, I thought it was very meaningful that they were not only saying, "Hey, this is what we believe in. This is what we think people should do and live their lives," and then they also said, "Hey, here's a pretty easy guide on how to do exactly what we're saying." So I always think it's good when people will stand up and say their piece, but also share with you an easy step of how to do that and kind of bridge that gap. So that was definitely that was very good to see, and I'm glad that people are able to. It's made accessible to see what they're talking about. Always a fan of that in a protest. And on just a more general note, there were some other protests going on that were not directly climate related. So it's kind of a difficult thing to see all of this because many issues are very important, and it's wonderful to see them represented, especially at a conference like this, where there are just so many important people from around the world that are present at this conference, and just in general, so many people. And it's interesting to see that the dynamics of issues that are not directly climate related being talked about here because they can be so important but not necessarily the space where we need them talked about. So it's a very interesting situation, but still good that people are able to express themselves to these world leaders and these representatives. And for for some of the protests to borrow their language, it is important that they speak up at these climate conferences and to borrow the language that the protesters have to use. Certain countries' military operations can emit hundreds of thousands of tons of carbon into the atmosphere. So there is absolutely intersection going on, even if it does detract somewhat from the message of how exactly are we going to solve this climate crisis. So it's been, as someone who's just in general a fan of demonstrations, very good to see more and more people as time goes on participating, even if the message is sort of diluting a bit, which is less cool to see. But overall, today was a very interesting day. Food, water, and agriculture in general are so important to the whole climate situation. Very important that they are talked about more and more even after today. I think that's going to end off my section for tonight.
All right, good work, Matthew. Yeah, protesting is probably one of the most fundamental, most important rights that any young climate activist should have, especially at these climate conferences, which continuously have a repeated history of listening to young activists in the past and then deciding not to act. So getting too much pressure on them because they didn't act, and then hosting the conferences in locations in which protesting isn't really an option. Uh, anyway, uh, now, from going from depressed into happy mode, I'm going to actually introduce our next speaker today. He's our very own Michael Fiddler. Michael, would you like to show us what's going on inside some pictures and maybe turn that background of yours into real life?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to show you another set of my photos. So let me share my screen and show you some of the images I have taken today. And since COP was related to agriculture, plus few of my friends asked me, hey, you just keep showing us the images of the plenaries and the meeting rooms, show us something also from Baku. So I decided to show you a few images from the market, which is just behind our house. The block of the flats that you can see in the background, that's not our block of flats, but we live right next to it, and just under our windows there is a huge market. So I walk through that, and here are a few images. So as you can see, it's full of fruit and vegetable, mostly locally grown. And if you want, you can easily get the freshly squeezed pomegranate juice. It's available, it's very cheap, and it's very tasty. It's really fresh. If you want to get some fresh meat, here is a sign that the cow was just slaughtered, because they just put the head on the ground to show that it's really fresh meat. So another example of really fresh product here in the market. And as you walk through the market, again, you can see fresh vegetable, plenty of various nuts. Some of them I can't even recognize what kind of nuts are there. It makes me feel like I'm a nut. But moving on, you can also get fresh fish. I am guessing they are from the Caspian Sea. The fish market is pretty stinky, so if you want something that doesn't smell so badly, you can go to the spices market that smells pretty nice. If you want something again a little bit stinky, you go just a few meters away, and there is the market with the pickled vegetable. It stinks horribly, but some people like it. And of course, the stinkiest, or in my opinion, the stinkiest market is the one with the meat. I don't even know which parts of what sort of meat is this, but as you walk around and take these images, it's fresh. At least we know it's fresh, and you can get. I'm guessing these are fresh heads of. Heads of cow. Goats or sheeps. I'm hoping it's not the heads of dogs I have seen in China previously. Now, this, if you want fresh cow legs, no problem, you can get that as well. Or if you want fresh brains, that's on offer as well. So agriculture is really on the right here. But let me finish the market section with this image. Once again, this would be the pomegranate, and this would be for the agricultural production of we can see in the bazaar. So moving on to COP. I just wanted to highlight once again the security. There are so many police officers everywhere. I took this image from the bus, and as you can see, there is a cops every 50 meters. You just cannot get away from them. Even if you get all the way to the venue, they are there every 15, oh, sorry, every 50 meters or so. They are simply there. Now, as I entered, this was one of the protests I saw today, but that's nothing new we haven't seen or reported on previously. Typically, it's about the funding. Give us more money. We need the money, and the money will fix it. So it's about the loss and damage funding. So I'm not spending much time on the protest, and I move towards the press conference Karabakh. Actually, I would take issues just with the name of the press conference room, because Karabakh is a region between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So it's a little, well, it's not so little punch. There was a war about this region already, two wars during the last 20 years between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan won the most recent war about 4 years ago. So it's a punch to the Armenians. We call this room, or as Azerbaijani, we call this room, it's Karabakh. So to show the world we won the war, it's our room. But let's not get stuck here, and let's move in. The gentleman who had the press conference there was the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, Thomas Vilsack. There was quite a bit of press. I was surprised that how many press people showed up. But if you walk backwards, and you could see that only half of the room was actually empty. So there was some press, but it was not as crowded as I would have expected. As soon as the press conference ended, there was an opportunity for the journalists to ask their questions. So the gentleman on the left, I think he was from Politico, and he basically asked how to keep Biden's legacy given the results of the recent election. So what the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture answer was, it was basically, it will be the people who got the benefits during the past 4 years. So those are the people who will keep those who will keep the legacy. Funding is available. Partnerships were already started and are extended. Farms are involved, and the funding which has been applied to the agriculture will remain there regardless of the majority in the Congress. I am not so sure that this is the case, but that's what the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture kept saying. I believe this would be the last image from the press conference. Then I went to the main plenary, because there were expressed, or there were delivered the national statements from the ministers of environment. I think I went through 4 of these national statements, and that was enough for the day, because it was kind of like copy paste. They were basically the same. If I could just give you a quick preview, it went like this. Thank you, Azerbaijan, for organizing these great events. We are thankful for organizing it and welcoming us here, and thank you to the nice people of Baku. Now, climate change cost us probably 5 to 7% of our GDP, so it's time to act. We need new ambition collective goals. There need to be finances for the poor African countries to achieve the climate goals. We need to work collectively. So let's work collectively, let's act now. I have heard it so many times. I have heard it in the previous COPs. And if we were now in COP21 or 27 or 35, I'm afraid it will be still the same. So I stood probably 4 of these national statements, and that was enough. So honestly, the most interesting part of the whole session here was when I check out some of the technical equipment the people who take care of the broadcast have there. Then I have to admit that I ended in this room by an accident. Actually, I was heading for room 23 and I did not pay attention. I ended up in room 25. But then there was the LDC Group Daily Coordination Meeting. The LDC is an abbreviation for Least Developed Countries. And I was kind of glad that I ended up here because, well, first, it was supposed to start at 1 p.m. and I was working on some emails and it was quiet there for a while. So I did not really notice that I was in a wrong room. And then the meeting started at 1:17, so roughly 20 minutes late. So one third of the time that the coordination meeting uh, should have taken was just wasted by waiting. And the LDCs, I believe, are about 45 least developed countries that try to coordinate their actions together. So when the facilitator kind of said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm 5 minutes late," while he was actually 17 minutes late, then the coordination meeting started, and it was all about loss and damage funding. But I wrote down a few of the expressions that were held there, and it was mostly, it is still under the discussion. We are still working on that. And so on. Actually, I was probably the only white guy in the whole room, and it was kind of empty. And here is the one slide that they were showing for those about 40 minutes. Uh, I don't really like to read the content of the slides, but here allow me to do that. It basically went NFPs, which are the national focal points. So those are typically the heads of the delegations, had a meeting yesterday, and notes will be shared about this meeting today. Unfortunately, there were supposed to be 45 of these NFPs in the meeting yesterday, and only 8 of them showed up. So you can imagine what sort of outcome of that meeting, what will be the outcome of that meeting. Again, ministerial briefing happened today. There will be another ministerial engagement today, and ministers are attending. So be on lookout for different communications. And that was about it. So I spent there 60 minutes, and I learned that there was a meeting yesterday. It's still under discussion, and notes from that meeting will be shared today. This gives you an idea how unproductive the time how unproductively the time can be spent here. But moving on, then I went to the pavilions, and as was mentioned previously, today was the day about agriculture and water. Here is an image from the cryosphere pavilion. I take this image every year or something similar. They always show there these very interesting graphs with curves, and the curves, in my opinion, are just getting worse and worse every year. I was not so sure where to go, so I kind of went with the crowd. And this pavilion looked pretty busy. I was wondering what was happening, and actually it was free food. They were just giving some free food. The queue was way too long for me, way too there. So I kept going. I ended up in another very busy pavilion. That's the Ukrainian pavilion. And here is the reason why there was such a huge crowd, because today is the 1000th. The war in Ukraine has been lasting for 1000 days already. So it's almost 3 years, the war going on there. There was a pretty big crowd, and it was also very international. They were introducing the various speakers as ambassadors. Some of them were really ambassadors from various embassies. Some of them were the party heads, and some of the politicians who spoke there, they were from countries, say, like Sweden, Finland, Germany, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and I took some images of their speeches, and it was kind of depressing to be there. Just to be sort of fair, obviously I had to walk to the Russian pavilion, and that was a different story. I was relaxed. We are here ready, help you with the digitalization. The pavilion was half empty. There were only very, very few people there. And I took also, well, I sat there for a while and listened to the various presentations. They wanted to give you the international feel. So there was this gentleman from Indonesia reporting on one of his projects related to the peatlands. But the project was done in year 2000. I didn't really get it why he was reporting about a project which was 4 years old. Then there was another lady speaking. That's the lady, the person second to from the right, and she spoke flawless English. She was obviously an American. But then I checked her badge, and she was there for Malawi. She was representing Malawi. That was really weird. And if you, as you can see, even the moderator of the session on the very left, even he got bored. And if I just show you the previous image, he was really bored the whole time, because reporting on a project which is 4 years old, and reporting on peatlands somewhere. I think it was somewhere in Central America, but I can't even remember. It was kind of boring. Uh, One last note. This morning I read an article about some Czech influencer who spent last few days in China, and he was kind of regretting that he went to China because he did not realize that he was going to be used for drawing much better image about China than China really is. And today I saw it. It was really live. There were these young people smiling, walking around, giving out free stuff. The gentleman on the left, he had perfect English. He approached every cute girl who walked around, offered some free stuff. He offered to this girl this traditional Chinese lantern. Uh, Offered, let's take some images for your Instagram and social networks, and the people were just buying. I mean, they were getting for free, but they were just buying that they are being treated so nicely. Um, the girl on the right, I think she was from the security, and she just showed up and says, "I did not get anything. I did not get any free gift." And suddenly, the Chinese gentleman was there. He didn't give her one panda. He better gave her two pandas just to make sure she was happy. I spent there maybe 15 minutes, and there was a constant rush of people coming in and getting the free stuff. Then I walked to the pavilion just next door, and again you could just get the free lanyard. Even I was tempted to get the free Chinese lanyard just to have a souvenir, but I did not really take it at the end of the day. And this would be the last image of the day, showing that COP is on for it's today. It's, I believe, day 9, and there are so many things going on that you need to take a rest, and people are getting tired. So this is an image of few of the young people who attended several of the sessions, and they just needed a break. So they lay down and took a break right there. And with this being said, I'm turning it back to you.
Wow, people are getting tired of COP29. That doesn't seem right. Most folks should be filled with energy and joy, or maybe give them a Red Bull or something. I don't know. Anyway, thank you so much for that showcase collage of information, Michael. If a picture's worth 1,000 words, then you've written maybe a doctoral dissertation by now. So congratulations, Dr. Michael. Anyway,
Thank you,
for those of you
almost Dr. Rock. Thank you.
almost a little few more years of suffering. Anyway, thank you to each of you who have joined us for our broadcast today. We will be continuing our broadcast throughout the end of the week. I will be also emceeing for tomorrow as well. For those of you who haven't yet followed our social media, our Instagram is campus.climatecore and our YouTube is just Campus Climate Core. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Keep in mind, if you do submit any questions to our social media, we will address them live during here on the stream.